The shooting occurred late last night, outside the Capitol Jewish Museum, where the American Jewish Committee was hosting an event called the Young Diplomats Reception. The suspect, 30-year-old Chicago native Elias Rodriguez, was seen pacing outside the event before approaching a group of 4 attendees and opening fire at close range. In a video recording of the moment of his arrest, Rodriguez could be heard shouting, quote, "Free Palestine." The 2 victims had been identified as 30-year-old Yaron Lechinsky and 26-year-old Sarah Lynn Milgram. According to the Israeli Foreign Ministry, 30-year-old Lechinsky was a research assistant at the embassy, while 26-year-old Milgram organized trips to Israel. Embassy staff say they're mourning the loss of their 2 colleagues who were reportedly set to be engaged to each other next week in Jerusalem. Reactions from a number of officials have blamed the attack on anti-Semitism. One of them, Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Yetshel Later, who called the shooting a moral depravity.
We are a resilient people. The people of Israel are resilient people. The people of the United States of America are resilient people. Together we won't be afraid. Together we'll stand, and we're going to overcome moral depravity of people who think that they're going to achieve political gains through murder.
U.S. President Donald Trump took to Truth Social late last night, saying, quote, "These horrible D.C. killings, based obviously on anti-Semitism, must end now. Hatred and radicalism have no place in the USA." While Secretary of State Marco Rubio tweeted, quote, "This was a brazen act of cowardly anti-Semitic violence. Make no mistake, we will track down those responsible and bring them to justice." So what do we know so far about the attack and its aftermath? To tell us more, we're joined now by Middle East Eye U.S. reporter Sean Matthews. Sean, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me on, Mohammed.
I know that you left D.C. just a couple of days ago, but no doubt you would have woken up and a lot of people in your network, colleagues, friends, people that are still in the city would have been reacting to this shooting. How would you describe the mood this morning in the Capitol?
Yeah, I think the whole world is reacting because I think it's a shock to DC, right? Because the American Capitol is not where especially Israel would expect an act of violence to take place, right, against its own staff members. So I think a sense of shock and probably vulnerability also for all the embassies that are based in DC is what we're experiencing right now. And of course, the staffers were extremely young who were killed. Aaron was years old, Sarah 26. So I think also that's probably playing on a lot of people's minds.
This incident has been described by officials as an anti-Semitic attack. What do we know, if anything, about the motivation of the suspect?
Yeah, look, right before I came on the show, I was reviewing, it looks like Arabic and English media reports are carrying a letter from Rodriguez, a so-called manifesto that he left apparently to be read after this shooting, and he's the suspect, I'll say again. But it looks like he is very much citing Israel's war on Gaza as his motivation for this shooting. He discusses what he calls Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. He cites at length kind of armed resistance. He makes 2 references that were very interesting to me. One is the reference to Aaron Bushnell, the U.S. service member who self-immolated himself in protest over Israel's war in Gaza. And he also cites former U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, the 60s defense secretary who was involved in the Vietnam War. And he talks about how McNamara was someone tried to push McNamara on a ferry in protest to the war in Vietnam. So I thought that was interesting that Rodriguez cited those 2 cases. But again, the Bushnell case incident stood out to me. And he also mentions clearly this war in Gaza. So from my take, reading this manifesto, it looks like he's linking this killing to the war in Gaza.
Now, this is something that took place in the heart of Washington, D.C., in between those embassies, just a stone's throw away from Capitol Hill. How significant is that?
Yeah, it's significant. Look, we should say that, the shooting didn't take place at the Israeli embassy. We should be clear about that, right? It was at a museum the Jewish Museum in the capital, so not exactly at the embassy. But like embassies anywhere else in the world, anywhere in the West, let's say in the U.S. or European capitals, embassies are fairly lightly guarded. There's a security guard outside. In Washington, a lot of embassies are right there at street level, on the sidewalk, and workers come and go. So even embassies themselves, when you think about it, they're not behind barricades like we think about in Iraq, the Green Zone, right? The U.S. Embassy in Iraq, where you have kind of legions of U.S. soldiers. That's not how it is in the U.S. or European capitals, for that matter, right? So embassies are fairly vulnerable, and I'm sure this is going to raise a lot of concerns among the Israelis regarding their embassies, basically across the West, in South America, in America, and in Europe.
Now, without getting too much into the manifesto or kind of motives or things like that, but it is impossible not to draw a connection between the ongoing war, genocide in Gaza, that 19 months in right now. And since the breakdown of the ceasefire back in March, when a lot of people were hopeful would be the resolution to what was happening in Gaza, the situation has since continued to be increasingly desperate and hopeless. Where are we at right now? Is there an off-ramp on the horizon?
Yeah, Mohammed, it is something to see. Look, I mean, I'm in DC. I go to the region often also, and whether I speak with U.S. officials, Arab officials, just observers or analysts, there is this sense that this war is just kind of dragging on, and that we have reached this point where something has to break, but it's not breaking. And this week was a great example of that. Yesterday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he gave a press conference, a briefing, and he basically laid conditions to end the war in Gaza. And he said that one of the conditions was the enactment of U.S. President Donald Trump's Riviera plan, which calls for a forced displacement of Palestinians and turning Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. And that was one of the conditions that he got to end. So the forced displacement of Palestinians, 2 million Palestinians from the Strip. I mean, if that's the condition to end the war, I think we are in a situation where, it's looking increasingly hopeless for people who are hoping to see some kind of a ceasefire, because the Israeli conditions at this stage, they're a non-starter. The only thing that the Israelis are really contemplating, it looks like, is a temporary ceasefire, in which they would, take back the 20 or so remaining hostages, and then reserve their right to go back to war in Gaza. And they've been very open about that's what they want. And that's why these negotiations are stuck, right? So I think there is very much a sense of kind of drift of just dragging this conflict out. And it doesn't really seem like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And I think, the political violence that we just witnessed today, the extremism, this could grow, right? It very much could grow. So it's a very dangerous time, I think. And there is not a lot of momentum behind diplomacy. You're not hearing that. You're not seeing that right now, right? We're seeing the Israeli demands. We're seeing aid not getting into Gaza. But again, not a lot of movement that gives people hope that this conflict is coming to an end anytime soon.
Sean Matthews, Middle East Eyes, U.S. reporter. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Mohammed.
Now let's talk about motive and justice. In his alleged 900-word manifesto, Elias Rodriguez justifies his attack on the Capital Jewish Museum by saying, quote, "I am glad that today at least there are many Americans for which the action will be highly legible and in some funny way the only sane thing to do." Now, it is deeply alarming to hear this act of political violence, which Rodriguez describes as an armed action, being connected to the horror we have seen in Gaza. It's hard not to draw parallels with two other acts of political violence we've seen in recent months, both justified as acts of justice. The first was the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, which narrowly missed the then presidential candidate and killed an innocent supporter in the stands, 50-year-old Corey Compertor. And of course, there was the killing of United Health CEO Brian Thompson, for which Luigi Mangione is now standing trial in New York. Political violence does not usually occur in a vacuum. It happens when a generation of young people loses faith in the rule of law, when they no longer feel seen or heard, when they no longer believe in the ability of their leaders to seek justice on their behalf. But it rarely, if ever, achieves its outcomes, justified or otherwise. The murder of these two diplomatic staff one of whom is a Christian, achieves no justice for the lives of 53,000 Palestinians killed by Israel over the last 19 months, not the 16,000 children dead, not the 10,000 still buried under rubble, the thousands more at risk now of starvation. Instead, it plays into the hands of the Israeli government, who have no issue spinning it to serve their own political aims. Just listen to Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar.
This is what happens when leaders in the world surrender to the Palestinian terrorist propaganda and serve it. The statements and attacks blame Israel instead of Hamas. Hamas started the war on October 7th, is solely responsible for the war's continuation, and is solely responsible for the suffering of Israelis and Palestinians alike.
Despite the strong stance Sa'ar takes, he understands something else to be true. Israel has been increasingly isolated on the world stage. It has lost the battle for public opinion, and it is fast losing its political support from its allies. But here is another response to what we saw last night from a group of Jewish Americans who have been fighting for Palestinian rights. They said this, quote, "In the wake of this attack, many Jews are fearful of gathering in Jewish communal spaces and being visible as Jews. Through our grief, we wrestle with their added fear that these murders will be used to justify further acts of violence and state repression. When we allow our hearts to harden to such an extent that we shrug off acts of violence and treat someone's identity as grounds to deny their humanity, we lose our own humanity in the process. This is true when we dehumanize Palestinians and when we dehumanize Israelis. Neither is acceptable." There are those who have already expressed support online for what happened in Washington, D.C. last night, seeing it as an extension of a just struggle. They are in the minority, but they are there. To those people, I have one simple question. What has it achieved?